And so out of this, me and a crew of people started up Catalyst Project. It was like, okay, how can we create anti-racist political education that is trying to move white people in large numbers? And the global justice movement, demonstrations in the World Trade Organization, mass direct actions against global capitalism were happening in the late 90s, early 2000s. It was a huge time of momentum, of energy. And one of my mentors, Elizabeth Petita Martinez, incredible longtime Chicano student activist, and she was actually a part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, one of the founders of the Women's Liberation Movement, longtime mentor. She was like, because she put out this essay called Where Was the Color in Seattle that created all this conversation about racism and privilege and organizing. And so she said to us, me and this crew of white folks that were trying to figure out starting up Catalyst Project, she said, now is the time to talk to white people. When there's upswings, when there's powerful momentum, this is a time to try to, because people are in motion, and people learn and grow when they're in motion in ways that are so deep, that are so transformative versus times of inactivity. You need to use moments of momentum to really move people. So you need to do this work. And a lot of the white people would talk to her, she wrote this essay kind of about racism in the movement, and she said, all these white groups keep talking to me about how can they get more people of color to join their groups. But you need to work with white groups to talk about what are the ways that they as white groups can work to end white supremacy. How can mostly white or all white groups join in solidarity and alliance and community with groups and communities of color to end and challenge white supremacy and work for racial justice? So that needs to be the work. So out of that work, we kind of had two different approaches. And we realized, in retrospect, we realized that we were operating for a good while from a damage control mentality. How do we keep white people from not messing up so much? Our job is to be anti-racist white people who build alliances and relationships with the groups of color, which is good. This is all good. This is all part of a developmental process. But we started to have an idea that, okay, now what we need to do is try to keep a close eye on all the white people and try to keep them from being so destructive to the broader movement and so destructive to people of color and people of color's organizations. We need to kind of try to control and limit the damage. But then what we realized was that, over time of doing that and it not being super effective, was that we need to come from an approach of how do we unleash the potential of multiracial democratic struggle? How do we help white people unleash their potential and the possibility to do meaningful, effective, concrete, visionary, courageous, anti-racist work? Does that sound cool? Yeah. So damage control, unleash potential. Those were two frameworks. And we started reading, different folks. And so Suzanne Farr, a longtime queer Southern organizer, she says, while the right wing is united by racism, sexism, and homophobia, the left is destroyed by racism, sexism, and homophobia. And so out of that, that's both a depressing statement that's very true, but we were like, okay, racism, sexism, and homophobia exist. So our job is to work to proactively, as much as possible, take them on, to not get so angry at people when they express those things, or to take all of our anger, which should be directed at these systems and at how it operates, and put them on individuals in our lives. We need to understand that this is a fact of organizing life, that we need to try to take on and increase our capacity to work to support people to move. So out of this, I met the Unitarian Universalists. Yeah. What? So Catalyst was invited to the Young Religious Unitarian Universalist National Leadership Conference in upstate New York in 2004. I had heard of a YRUU, but I didn't really know what one was. So I walk into this camp with 100 youth leaders of YRUU, and they are on fire. And we're there to do several days of anti-racist training and work with them. And just shout out a few words that you would describe about the YRUU youth. Positive energy, passion. Yeah, transformative. On fire, right? So we're doing these trainings, and I'm just like, who are these 15-year-olds who are like, yeah, so this is my fourth anti-racism training. I actually just organized one for my regional con. And I was like, con? What the hell's a con? But I learned fast. I just organized one in my regional con, and so now we're trying to figure out how we can develop more youth leaders. And I was like, oh my God! And then there's like 70 of these like teenagers like using like complex consensus process to make like really actually quite effective decisions about all kinds of things on a national continental level that was like blowing my mind. They're just like, who are they? And then they're doing all these like trainings, and they're so like, their hearts are so open and positive. And then there's like all these like spiritual rituals at the late at night where people are like, stand like this if you want to be hugged and affirmed about the truth of your humanity. Stand like this if you'd prefer not to be touched, but you'd rather someone just whisper how much they love you in your ear. I was like, I want to be hugged. I was like, hug me. But one of the things so as we were doing this work, we were like, okay, these Unitarian Universalists, there's a lot of analysis. There's a lot of like really smart thinking. And there was a lot of like real concern about how to have the right language, about how to use the right words, the right language. And it was really clear that they just, people didn't want to screw each other over. They didn't want to be doing microaggressions all the time. They didn't want to be splitting up their, because it was like white youth and youth of color, and people wanted to do the right thing. So one of the things that we realized, though, at Catalyst, we were like, okay, there's an incredible depth of commitment, of passion, of analysis. But the next phase, two next phases, were absolutely essential. One was to connect anti-racism, consciousness, language, culture, to anti-racist practice and action, involvement in the community, not just within the congregation, but also in the community, to connect anti-racism to actually trying to challenge and change structures of inequality. Getting involved in campaigns, getting involved in organizations, bringing anti-racism into the streets. The second thing was to make anti-racism something that was healing and nourishing, and not something that created incredible anxiety and guilt and shame and rage and anger. Those things are part of the process, but we can't stop there. So the Unitarian youth were incredible. And they brought me into the Unitarian Universalist faith. So all of that brings to Arizona. So in the build-up to Arizona, it was incredible, right? Incredible outrage, incredible protest. I mean, there was national outrage and momentum about what was happening in Arizona, both within the state and all over the country. I mean, incredible levels of public protest from lots of different places. And the UUs were like, we are going to throw down. We are going to be there. And so I was working with Catalyst with Puente, the migrant justice group in Phoenix, with the Ruckus Society, who's there to like help support the direct action mass civil disobedience, a whole range of groups. And we knew, people were like, okay, the UUs are coming. They're talking to like Ken Brown, who is like, the district, district organizer there. We're talking to them. The UUs are coming. They're going to be really involved. That's awesome. But then it became clear that there weren't a lot of people who were going to be doing civil disobedience in general. So we're like, okay, we need to drastically increase the amount of people who are doing civil disobedience. We need to have mass action. And so people started working on that both within like the Puente community, within a whole range. And the basic strategy was we need to get influential people in different parts of these different communities to commit to doing civil disobedience and to talk to their people about why they're doing it, and to both lead through words but also through example. And so I remember we'd have these meetings every day, and would have like the list up of like how many people do we have committed to doing it. And at first it was like 12 people total. And in the UUs it was, 6 people. And I remember that I started talking to all these different like UU organizers, and a lot of UU organizers were really bitter and angry about what they felt was going to be the lack of radical action by UUs. We're like, all the UUs are going to come, they're just going to like wear their shirts, they're not going to go to the actual actions, they're going to like go and sing in service, they're going to like show up here, show their faces, go leave all the like real activity to like the local community, and then say in all their newsletters for the next 10 years that they were there and they were awesome. That's all that's going to happen. And I was like, well, what can we do different? Because, it was clear the momentum was there, and a lot of you were feeling it, right? The momentum was there for something not like that. The momentum was there for something that was going to be incredible, that could be far more transformative. And so, but then I started talking to all these other organizers who said that they felt like there was an incredible amount of fear holding back potential UU involvement. And a lot of people who wanted to do something more radical said, well, I feel accountable to these congregations who are really afraid and don't want to do this. Or I feel accountable in this way. I feel accountable. All these people started talking about how accountable they felt to not doing what they thought would be the best thing to do. And so it was like, okay, that's great that there's this level of accountability. But this accountability is actually creating a roadblock to momentum. So we need to do some things here. So the first thing was to try to start getting UUs arrested earlier on. So our comrade here from Arizona, who was part of one of the early civil disobedience actions and did it and rocked it. Another example, another leader in the community. But then it was also, how can we get Reverend Susan Frederick Gray to do civil disobedience? And so she became like my key, like I need to have multiple conversations with her about why this needs to happen. And it was tricky, and I'm going to share something with you that I don't usually share. So she felt very accountable to Puente, which is understandable. But there were differences of opinion in Puente about civil disobedience. The folks who were more connected to the grassroots, in my opinion, the people who were more really involved in organizing this, were like, yes, civil disobedience. But there were some folks who weren't as involved, who were kind of stepping back, but were also leaders, who were like, I don't think this is the right thing to do. And so sometimes when we organize, it gets complicated, right? It's not always easy. It's not like, well, let's just do what Puente says. So in that moment, it was like, yes, let's do what Puente says. And let's also think about what are we trying to politically achieve? What is politically possible in this moment to try to challenge the racism in Arizona? And not just say just line up all the dots around accountability, but also be accountable to our vision and our purpose and our politics. And so we were trying to get more and more folks involved. And I remember Reverend Susan, she came to one of the direct action trainings. All the direct action trainings were happening around the community. And she came to one, and she was actually going to do the same action, but then she decided not to. And I thought this was actually incredibly courageous and incredibly bold and very strategic and visionary. She said, I actually want to preach on Sunday to my congregation and explain to them why I'm going to do civil disobedience and invite them to both support me and participate. I remember being in that service and I cried my eyes out because I was like, this is religious leadership. This is spiritual leadership. She was speaking to her congregation and she moved people. And she was like, let's bring the base. And that's what we need to do. We need to think about who is our base, not only as if we're ministers, but all of us have bases. All of us have communities who we can influence, who we can move, and we need to be thinking about how we build our base and how we move our base. And she, along with many other people, helped to move their base in Arizona and also around the country. So the next thing we did, because the original plan was that the UUs were going to go in vans and go all over the broader city to shopping malls and suburbs and sing in solidarity with the actions that were going to be happening in the city core. So in the city core, there would be a handful of UUs and then a lot of folks from Puente in the directly affected, most negatively affected communities doing direct action. But most UUs from around the country were going to be all over in the suburbs singing about standing on the side of love and handing out flyers about immigrant rights. And the strategy made some sense around as a mostly white faith, there could be a real appealing to white people in the suburbs to try to build support around this. But we were like, no, we need to get the UUs, again, being in the same space, sharing space, being in the streets together, being in jail together, being in these spaces is deeply transformative and builds relationships that can transform who we are as people. This is a moment to build a long-term relationship between the UUA and the migrant justice movement that is going to last a decade and beyond. And that's what we're doing. And so we were like, we need to have the direct action training in the sanctuary of the main church. We need to have every religious leader we can possibly get to start telling everyone they know that they should go to that training. We need to get Reverend Susan to, before the training, announce that she's again doing direct action and that she encourages everyone to go. We need to tell everyone that not only are they wanted in doing this action, but this is a way we can bring our faith, our spirituality, and bring our church into the streets. We'll bring our songs, we'll bring our symbols, we'll bring our faith, we'll bring our commitment, and we'll bring anti-racism into the streets. And a lot of people were really scared and had a lot of really big concerns. Well, what if we mess up? What if we say offensive things? Our people aren't ready. And so we kept responding. It's not about what people say in this moment. What they do will speak far louder. Don't be afraid of what could happen. Put your faith in the possibility of what we can do. Don't let the fear prevent us from the possible. It's not about just having the right language, the right words, the right analysis. It's about having leadership and structures of organizational change to help us do the best we can, as often as we can, to advance goals of racial justice. Does that sound good? So one of the key things, and I'm going to start to wrap up here. A few key things, though, that helped in Arizona. And, people know the details. I mean, unbelievable amounts of UUs got arrested. Unbelievable amounts of UU people were doing, and again, I say this not to be like, oh, getting arrested is the most important thing. Because what was actually just as important was how many UUs were in the streets providing support. Political support with chanting. How many? Yeah. And about, at least, I don't know the actual numbers, but it was closer to 60 UUs took arrest doing civil disobedience. And then dozens and dozens more were doing direct support in the streets, bringing people water, which is also risking arrest. Giving people water, taking people's numbers to call loved ones, doing support in the streets. Hundreds of UUs were doing this. And it was amazing because in Puente, again, all of this is very complex because there was people in Puente, organizers, activists of color, who were also very nervous about all these UUs. Are they going to take over our organization? Are they going to try to speak for us? Are they going to try to claim this struggle as theirs? Are they going to try to claim anything positive out of this as their own? Are they just going to come and take over the space and be kind of ignorant white folks that just sort of push us out of the way and take over? And so we had to have really complex conversations amongst the organizing crew of folks of color, of white folks about how can we all do the most we can to increase the capacity for all of our people to do the best we could. Let's give it a try. Because you know what? If we don't give it a try, we're going to keep losing. We're going to keep being small. We're going to keep being ineffective. So if we want to keep doing what we're doing now, we're going to lose. If we want to win, we need to start doing things that feel counterintuitive, but that open up possibilities for something different. So there was a lot of nervousness all over the place. But I will tell you, talking with Puente folks, talking with youth and young folks who were in Puente, who were like, I've never seen so many white people be at our demonstrations before. And at first, I was really nervous about what that might be. But it was beautiful. We started telling people in our community, if you need something, if you need water, if you need a ride, if you need help, look for the people with the yellow shirts. In the jail, the night of the mass arrest, when people were in jail, Joe Arpaio's jail is the site of incredible repression and an institution that is meant to break people's spirits, break people's sense of power, and terrify migrant, immigrant, undocumented brown communities in Arizona. That night, with 60, 80 people in jail, rain coming down, people danced in the streets in front of Joe Arpaio's jail. Communities in Arizona and Phoenix that said, I never would have imagined that we would be feeling a sense of our power to claim this space. And UUs, white UUs, and activists of color from Puente, tango dancing in the streets in front of Joe Arpaio's jail. And so, people, like my mentor, Elizabeth Bettina Martinez, she said, people move when there's momentum. We can't look around and be like, why aren't people doing things? We need to ask, how can we create opportunities for people to do things? How can we create mechanisms of support to help them do those things? How can we create mechanisms that are going to help them reflect on what they've done so they go deeper next time and they commit long haul? How can we, as people who are engaged, who want to see change, start taking responsibility for our people? To not leave them, to not abandon them, to not look at them and condemn them. Every white person in this country needs to be saved from the horror of white supremacy. Every white person in this country needs to have the opportunity to be on the right side of history, and we need to create opportunities and opportunities and opportunities for them to stand on the right side of history and join. Be on the train for liberation. Be on the side of justice. Join the river of multiracial democratic struggle and know that this is a struggle for their own souls, their families, their communities, their future. And we need to help that happen. Our spiritual, it's so beautiful to be here because oftentimes I talk with secular activists and I speak in a way that the Spirit is moving in me, and I'll speak in ways of how we need to connect to our deeper purpose. But I say here, our spiritual calling is to help save our people, all of our people, but also the people that we sometimes don't want to be associated with. The white people who we hate. Because oftentimes the people who we hate are the people who look just like we did 2 weeks ago. And so one of the things that can help us is to have an asset perspective versus a deficit perspective. And so an asset perspective, so a deficit perspective is basically, how many of us can do this? We walk into a conference and we say, well, this wasn't done right. This wasn't organized well. That workshop was full of it. This person's a hypocrite. Those people aren't really committed. This is a bunch of BS, same old, and then go on Facebook and say, the movement is dead. We have really sharp knives of critique because we develop those knives seeing all these ways that institutions and systems of oppression operate. We have sharp knives of critique because we see the failings and we see the ways that communities are being screwed over. But we turn those knives so often on each other. And it's not just each other, because oftentimes we can make a long list of what's wrong with all of you, and then go home and make a long list of what's wrong with myself. And so we need to have an asset approach of being able to see what is positive, what is working, what do we often take for, because often what's good and working is taken for granted. So being able to see what is often taken for granted so that we can see assets and strengths and ways that we could grow, and see those as ways to help us deal with our weaknesses, to help us deal with the ways that we're not doing as well as we could. So assets. So while a lot of UUs were talking in Arizona about like, oh no, the UUs are just going to do this, and they're not going to do this, and they're too afraid to do this, we could do that. But why? Let's talk about what we can do. What are the assets we have? And there are tremendous assets. So the other thing is, rather than having a focus on the problems, a focus on opportunities. So we need to be able to see the problems. We need to be able to see what the problems are that we face in our congregations, in our communities, and in our movement. But constantly have an eye towards how the problems can be a next step to seeing opportunities for change. So regularly seeing like, wow, there's like all these different ways that we could bring people more into this work. There's this ways that we could ask people to step up here, to step up there. The undocubus, the undocumented bus of immigrant, migrant justice activists and allies that went throughout the Southeast and then stayed at UU churches all over. This is after Arizona. They stayed at my church in Knoxville. That was an incredible way to leverage the resources of the UU church for people to stay there, for people in the UU church to then cook and prepare meals for those folks, and then again, be in the same space, share space, support the struggle. People who might not at this point in their lives be like, yes, I'm down to do civil disobedience to stop the deportations in my community, but I am going to show up and I'm going to make food. And making food and hospitality is an incredibly radical act when it's in service and in support of a movement like this. We need to expand what is radical to include a wide range of activities that can involve thousands and thousands and thousands of people and help build momentum to keep people moving. So my final point here is just the need for leadership. We need to become the leaders that our commitment to being allies call us to be. And sometimes being allies can sometimes feel like, well, we shouldn't be leaders. We should be looking to and following the leadership of others. And that is an absolutely critical part of good liberation leadership, is to see leadership around, to listen, to ask questions. But we also need to understand that part of who we need to be is increasing our capacity to help lead more and more of our folks away from white supremacy and towards collective liberation. That when we see things and be like, this is horrible, the next question is, and what can I do about it? And maybe you don't know what to do about it, but then ask others, what can we do about it? We need to become leaders that can move our people in large numbers to join the river of multiracial democratic struggle. Does that sound good? Yes. So yes, we need to be humble. And we need to be tender. We need to be tender with the complex humanity of who we are and share that with our people. To not come in and be like, I've got it all figured out, I'm right, I'm here to lead you. But to use our own stories, our own mistakes, our own struggles, our own fears as a way to open space for other people to be vulnerable about their own. And then as a way we can create sacred space of acknowledging and being real about our humanity in a way that then moves us towards the sacred work of justice. Does that sound good? So the only other thing I'm gonna add here is to think about leadership in a collective way. How we can be regularly becoming literate in appreciating the leadership of others. Being able to see the ways that we do different things and acknowledging it, speaking it, naming the ways that we see people growing and taking risks and appreciating it, and then developing the capacity to actually appreciate ourselves. You know, how many people have organized events where then like 10 people come up and they're like, that was a fantastic event. And then one person comes up and says, yeah, it was okay. And then the next day all you can think about is, oh, my event was just okay. And that's understandable. We want to grow, we want to keep moving. But we also need to be able to see the positive, the effects that we're having, and be able to build momentum. So in closing, let's support each other's leadership. Let's regularly root ourselves in our relationships to those who have helped us, the movements and legacies that they're a part of, our own history. Let's hold on to each other, lift each other up, and let's be courageous, visionary leaders for social justice in our communities. Let's break apart the white community away from white supremacy and unite our people who are white to the river of multiracial democratic struggle. Let's do it, my friends. So I think we're going to wrap up here in a minute, unless there's someone who has some announcements or things.
20 minutes until lunch, so I think question and answer.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So any questions or
let's
comments?
take about 20 minutes for question and answer or so. So who's got a question?
Hi, I'm Deborah Boyd, and I'm actually on the General Assembly Planning Committee. I was planning on being here with you last night, but didn't get a chance to. But I did want to invite you all to stand with the hotel workers that we are choosing to support by not doing some of the housing at GA in Providence this year. I know there's been some conversation on the GA listserv, and I just really want to invite you to be compassionate with each other and with the Planning Committee and with the City of Providence as we try to find additional housing. So please stand with these folks and understand that that's why we're not going to be housing folks in those particular hotels, and take an opportunity to stand with them. So there are 2 hotels in Providence that the Planning Committee has stepped away from those contracts. We have a fabulous contract that was written through the office with Jan Snegas and some of our attorneys that enabled us to step away from those reserved blocks of rooms. One happened back in December. That same owner later bought a hotel early this year. We were really hoping that that particular owner would wait to change their employment practices until after we had been in Providence, but that's not the case. So just a few days before we opened registration for rooms for General Assembly, they were taking action against their workers, action against their workers who were attempting to organize, action against their workers who were attempting to log all their hours, action against workers who were needing to step away from that job for a small period of time because their child was ill. And so we are really, because of our commitments that we made in General Assembly, I think it was back in 2007, but somebody will probably correct me, to not engage in supporting hotels that are not supporting their workers, we stepped away from that contract in that block of rooms. Unfortunately, Providence is teeny tiny. So when you step away from a block of 100 or plus rooms, that has a big impact on what we're able to house close to the convention center. So if you have a hotel room that's close and you are able to look at options that are a little bit farther away, please feel free to suggest offering those on the General Assembly listserv, because there are folks who need to be closer either logistically or because they have physical challenges or other pieces that they're involved with. But also understand that this is part of how we live our faith. You can be a little bit inconvenienced to support a working mom who needs to stay at home with her kid one day, or to help folks that are trying to organize to get better working conditions for themselves. So please, I appreciate it, and I so appreciate being able to share this with this group of UU leaders, because it's you who will be able to step out on that listserv and make a difference in supporting each other as we go forward in supporting these workers. We have made clear which hotels those are and invited people not to book in those hotels. There's also a list of all of the hotels that that particular owner owns, because they're not just in Providence, they're actually across the U.S. And so both of those lists are available on the UU listserv. And I believe on the website as well.
Thank you for that announcement. It's good to keep in mind what's going on right now, what our struggles and our challenges are. So thank you for raising that. So do we have any questions? Chris. Meet me halfway, Tom.
So my understanding is that you would identify yourself as an anarchist still? Sort of? Okay.
Yeah.
So,
in a more complicated, An anarchist who believes in leadership and building a democratic organization and a whole wide range of things.
So,
he also believes in the importance of electoral politics and reform struggles as part of a larger revolutionary
So
framework.
that's my question is, I'm curious about the role that you understand in terms of where electoral reforms and working with governmental systems and stuff fits into that movement for collective liberation, and where the problems lie in that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I mean, I think a lot of those struggles are really key places for more and more people to come in, to get involved, to get active. And so somebody who I really look to a lot around this is a longtime organizer in the civil rights movement, Ella Baker. And Ella Baker, I mean, folks, I really encourage folks to learn more about her if you don't already know about her. I've Got the Light of Freedom by Charles Payne is an incredible book about the Mississippi organizing tradition. And really looking at the way, so, after Brown versus Board of Education went down, Ella Baker, Bayard Rustin, and a guy, a white anti-racist socialist named Stanley Levinson. The three of them had been meeting and were basically like, okay, and then also folks, in the South, lots of people were basically like, how do we turn what is going to be a legal battle and a kind of more, what could be kind of a more like reformist struggle around desegregation? How could we turn that struggle into a mass movement about challenging white supremacy on a fundamental level, culturally, socially, economically, so that it doesn't become professional class of lawyers and academics and journalists who wage a battle of ideas and a battle in the courtrooms. We need this to be a grassroots movement based in working class communities in the Black South that then unite the rest of the country around an agenda of black freedom. But we do, in fact, need to fight for desegregation. We do, in fact, need to engage at the level of electoral politics, around voting rights. We need to engage in the struggle around desegregation. And so to ignore those struggles would be essentially marginalizing yourself from the primary places where people are going to be putting their passions, their hearts, and their lives in struggle for justice. And so we could be like, I'm going to be more radical than thou, and I don't want to get my hands dirty, and, da-da-da-da. But they engaged in those efforts with the perspective that grassroots people power is the primary source of change. And so, yes, the lawyers will play a role. Yes, the professional classes will play roles. But there are many, many roles to play. And as organizers, we need to be thinking about multiple levels of change, but always with the eye towards how are we building grassroots democratic movements that are transformational. And Ella Baker talked about transformational organizing means that not only are we trying to change what's wrong in society, but through the process of organizing for that change, we are transforming ourselves and our communities to challenge the fear in the black community, the internalized lies and hatred of white supremacy on the black community, to come from a place of loving oneself, loving one's community, affirming one's blackness. And so for white anti-racists, for white people to be able to heal and grow in the struggle against racism in a way that's transformative and connects us to a deeper power. So yes, we're going to win electorally, and we're going to get some really good people in office. Yes, we're going to win some ballot measures. Yes, we're going to try to change policy and legislation. Yes, those struggles are absolutely key. But Tim Wise, he has this like quote. He's like, let's have, how does he say? He says, let's have reform struggles not be arsenic that kill our movements. You know, you win something and the movement's gone. But let's have reform struggle wins be adrenaline that motivate us for the long haul struggle. So essentially that's how I understand my anarchism.
Since I monopolized the floor with an announcement, I'll monopolize the floor with a question apparently as well. So you spoke about your transformation and your joining the Unitarian Universalist faith community. And I was just wondering if you might speak a little bit more about how this particular faith tradition has grounded and fed your understanding of this work.
Yeah, absolutely. It was actually... like throughout my life, I've always felt a deep connection to God. I mean, God in a really broad sense. Like, I mean, as a kid and as a teenager and in my 20s, you know, I always felt this connection. I'd be just like kind of talking with God all the time about like, you know, things that were hard or things that were beautiful and just this kind of conversation with God. And looking back at my childhood, I was kind of in this like kind of a culturally Christian family, but we didn't have like a real strong like spiritual, like a religious. But I look back and I'm like, wow, my parents were kind of Unitarian Universalists. You know, my dad would like take me out on this huge, you know, beautiful mountain in Yosemite, and would look out at Yosemite, and he'd be like, "This is church. The beauty of this world, and just standing here together. You, my son, this is church." You know, they like sent me to a Jewish preschool because they wanted to know that there was like completely other worldviews. But anyway, all that to say, as a young activist, I was like, okay, there's a lot of things I'm trying to figure out politically, so I'm going to wait until I turn 30 to figure out my spirituality. I'm going to wait till I'm 30 to figure out my spirituality and also what my position is on Israel and Palestine. And it was actually pretty amazing because when I met the YRUU, I had just turned 30. And I was experiencing a lot of burnout and depression and anxiety. It was like a couple years after September 11th, the anti-war movement, just like activist efforts all over the place were like at like warp speed. And it was like, oh my God, this is going to keep going. And I had just come back from a strategy conference with all these movement elders who had been involved since like the 50s. And some of them were like, yeah, this is like pretty much like the worst political moment I've ever seen in my life. This is like 2003. And I came home from that strategy conference where I was hoping to be like really reinvigorated and like come back with like, okay, what are we going to do? I mean, actually really amazing things came out of that, but the relationships that came out of that helped to create some of the momentum around the world, so the U.S. Social Forum and some really positive things. But nonetheless, I came back from that strategy conference and I had my first panic attack. And I thought I was going to die, you know? It's like, oh my God, what's happening to me? And I started having like panic attacks like regularly. And so I met the UUs and I was like, I need deeper spiritual nourishment in my life. It is time to start opening myself up and not be afraid of the possibilities of deep spiritual connection, not just by myself, but with others. I need to return to how beautiful prayer is. I need to start meditating with my people in congregational settings at the Oakland church in that time. And it really had an incredible impact on me, both in terms of dealing with my own like depression, burnout, anxiety, but also helping me to connect to a deeper feeling of meaning. Yes, there's the river of multiracial democratic struggle, but there's also the ocean of our humanity that is just like incredibly beautiful and complicated and full of mystery and what's divine. And so becoming a UU has been incredible. And, I dreamed of my child sitting in a UU church in Knoxville. And then, a few months later, it was like, all right, pregnancy is here. It was amazing. It was beautiful. It was fantastic. But yeah, becoming a UU and the spiritual connection and tradition has been a process of return to what is sacred, to what is divine, and opening myself up to it more and more in the UU community settings, congregational life, services, worship, have been incredibly meaningful for me as a whole person, not just as an activist, but as a whole person. And so when I think about, not growing up with like seeing white people speaking about racism who weren't racist, when I think about my son growing up in a world where I want him to have so many role models of incredible people, it's like, I want him to grow up in democratic social movements and also around a whole lot of UUs, I want him to go through the OWL. I want him to like go through, be at one of these youth empowerment, let's build a movement conferences, these kinds of things. So yeah, it's been deeply important to who I am. And actually, so when I went to Arizona for that in 2010 for summer, I did something that I'd been so like wanting to do, but I was like so scared. And I was like, well, this will also be a way of like building deeper connection to what's happening in Arizona here in Oakland. And I asked the Minister of Social Justice, Reverend Jacqueline DeHart, the Minister of Social Justice at our church. I said, will you pray on me? And she's like, yeah, I'll pray on you. And then she was like, let's get the whole congregation to pray on you. I was like, she was like, I'll make an announcement that you're going to Arizona and that whoever wants to come and like pray on you can. I was like, oh my God, okay. And so like 20 people, like I explained what I was doing. I explained what was happening in Arizona and what we were going to try to do. We were going to try to like have this transformative experience around the UUs throwing down big in this broader movement. And I wanted people to pray on me and help me to feel not only grounded in our spiritual faith and tradition, but to like help call me into being the person I want to try to be there. And it was so beautiful, and I just like cried, and it was like she had her, people had their hands on me, and were praying, and I felt them the whole time I was in Arizona. I felt them. And then people, when I came back, were like, felt connected to me, and were like, how was it? Like, what happened? What did we do? That's when you know. That's when you know that something divine is happening, when we start to ask each other, you went and did this thing. How did we do? Amen. So, I want my son to grow up with role models and leaders like you. I don't want him to think that the only people who speak about justice and who speak about racism are racist. I want him to have a spiritually nourished life. And so we as a faith, we as a community are a part of that with many others. So, I look at, part of why I'm so happy to be here is because, you are the community, you are the leaders who are part of the world that we want to build and who I want my son to grow up around.
Thank you.